Welcome to Lesson 7 in your Aylsham High Citizenship course. This lesson is all about the judicial system, and as such, it fits with this week's big question about offenders. Quick recap, can you remember the three branches of power in the UK? So one begins with E, one begins with L, and one begins with J. You should have remembered executive, legislature and judicial. So today we're looking at the judicial system. The judicial system is made up of three main areas: the courts, the police and prisons. So what is court? A court is a body of people presided over by a judge, judges or magistrate, and acting as a tribunal in civil and criminal cases. So we're going to look at all of those words and find out what they mean. Judge, magistrate, tribunal, civil and criminal cases. Criminal law essentially relates to offences and breaches that negatively affect society as a whole rather than just one person. So to be guilty of breaking criminal law, it needs to affect society as a whole. So that might be criminal damage, sexual assault, murder, fraud, money laundering, drug dealing. Civil law is quite different from criminal law. Civil law is concerned with the rights and property of individual people or organisations, which may not always be protected by criminal laws. So civil law, rather than being about punishment and prison, is about remedy and repayment. So this involves things like family disputes, personal injury, breaches of contracts, employment law, and tribunals. So civil law is about remedy and repayment. Criminal law is about punishment and prison. A person can face criminal and civil action at the same time. So you can be guilty of both or be tried for both. So a robber, for example, would face criminal charges, but also compensation might need to be paid through civil action. A fraudulent moneylender might have no criminal charges, but compensation through civil action. So the court structure in the UK, you have various levels of court. You've got the Supreme Court at the top, the Court of Appeal, High Courts, and then at the bottom there you've got Crown Courts and Magistrates' Courts, and then County Courts and Tribunals. So the left-hand side is the criminal law structure, right-hand side is the civil law. So you work your way up really from the bottom depending on the level of the crime that has been committed. So what is a tribunal for civil law? So the word comes from tribune, which means head of the tribe. And a tribunal is basically a panel of people whose main cases tend to involve employment law. Tribunals aren't part of the constitutionally established system of government, but courts are. So a tribunal is a group of people you would go in front of to state your case, usually involving some aspect of employment law. So nobody's broken a criminal law, but civil law has come under question. So you go in front of a tribunal to get a decision made. So when it comes to criminal law, what happens first is the police force step in. So the police will arrest and then they will charge somebody with an offence. And on the left there, you've got different levels of police individuals. So the police arrest and charge people they believe have broken criminal law. Then we have the CPS, or the Crown Prosecution Service, and they are the people who then proceed with court proceedings after the arrest by the police if there is sufficient evidence. So the Crown Prosecution Service, prosecute literally means to follow up or to pursue. So that's what they do. They prosecute, they follow up criminal cases that have been investigated by the police and other investigative organisations in England and Wales. And the CPS is independent and they make decisions independently of the police and government. So it's quite, in theory, quite a good organisation because they are separate from anyone else. They look at individual cases and they decide if prosecution is required. So this is what happens between the police, the CPS and the courts. A crime is committed. The suspect is arrested and interviewed by the police. The CPS are consulted to see if there is sufficient evidence. If there is, the suspect is then charged with the crime and the CPS begin prosecution. Before that prosecution is decided, the defendant enters their plea in court. So the person who has been accused of the crime enters their plea. If they enter a plea of guilty, then the CPS will deliver a sentence. If they enter a plea of not guilty, then it will go to trial. So that's when you see the trials in court. It's because the defendant has said they are not guilty. So further investigation needs to be done. If the defendant enters a guilty plea, then the CPS goes straight to prosecution via the judge. And that's the end of the situation. And then the result is various. So you can have a custodial sentence where you are sent to prison. You might have a fine, or you might be given a community order, which involves community service. So you might have to do 100 hours of community service, picking up litter or whatever it may be. So, His Majesty's Prison Service. There are 117 prisons in the UK, and most are run by HM Prison Service. 14 prisons at the moment are run privately by companies such as G4S and Serco. So we'll look at privatisation in a later lesson, but most of the prisons in the UK are run by a central service, HM Prison Service. So the last check that I did was in April 2022. I don't think it's changed hugely, but the number of people in prison at the moment is around 80,000 people. The population in the male estate, so the number of male prisoners is around 76,000. The number of female prisoners is around 3,000. The operational capacity, so the amount of spaces that there are, is 82,092. So we are almost at capacity for prison population in the UK. So let's have a look at some rights for prisoners. So when you go to prison, you can't have physical money. You're not allowed physical money. You can't spend more than £15 a week of your own money. There are some cases where people will have higher income of 20, but the lowest is usually 5. But you can't spend more than £15 a week of your own money. You cannot have a mobile phone. You cannot call anyone who is not on your phone list. So you'll have a list of people you can call, and you can only call them from payphones in prison that you need to pay for with a phone card. You can't vote. You lose your right to vote in a democracy. What you can do is phone on prison phones with a phone card. You can earn privileges, and there are basic, standard and enhanced privileges that might involve things like being able to watch TV, being able to take more than an hour out of your prison cell in a day. You can buy personal items, so you can get radios, you can buy bathroom things and so on, so you can get personal items. You can and you must work or educate while inside, that allows you to earn £10 to £20 a week. So you can earn money whilst you're in prison. You must do either work or education. And you can eat 3 basic meals a day. The average time served in UK prisons by offenders is 18 months. So the length of service is not that long in prison, and that has implications for what happens when people come out of prison, which is what we'll look at next. So, really interesting area of study in the UK is looking at what happens when people come out of prison. Reoffending is a huge problem in the UK, and at the bottom there it tells you that 25% of offenders go on to reoffend within 1 year of release. So when they've been in prison, they come out, and a quarter of offenders go on to reoffend. The total cost of that at the top in 2016, so this will be much higher now, but the only number I could find was 2016, and the cost of reoffending was £18.1 billion. The total spend on prisons in 2016 was 3.63 billion. So we're spending considerably more dealing with reoffending than we are managing the prisons that are in the country. Between 2009 and 2019, rehabilitation work fell by 62% in prisons across the UK. So rehabilitation is the work that is done to help people to rebuild, to rehabilitate, which means potentially that when they get out of prison, they have opportunities. They have been educated, they have done work that's given them experience to then get a job outside or follow a different life path. Rehabilitation is hugely interesting, and I think for me personally as a teacher, it's something that I definitely would like to see change in the UK. Because of the power of education and the difference it can make to people's lives. So if you have a look at your workbook, there should be time left for you to go back over those questions. There's some true, false. There are some boxes to fill in with information you've found out, but hopefully that's given you a good insight into how things work in the UK with the judicial system.